Hello, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to session 4B and our third day at our conference at CIGA, the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at ISU. Our conference has been trying to coordinate between different time zones and different people. We're really honored to have you as guests, and to all of our viewers on Facebook. Welcome again to a session. This is the last session of the day. For all of you who are tuning in and you are listening to either the English or the Arabic version, and it's not the language of your choice, you can obtain a link for the language that you need, either English, Arabic, or Turkish, from our school website. You have to go to isu.edu.tr/CIGA conference. On that webpage, you will see the different links for the different languages. I will begin by introducing our panelists, and then I will hand it over to our first panelist. Our first panelist is Dr. Ovamir Anjum from the University of Toledo. He is the Imam Khattab Endowed Chair of Islamic Studies at the Department of Religious Studies and Philosophy. He is the author of Politics, Law, and Community in Islamic Thought, the Taymiyan Moment, Cambridge University Press. He is an active member of many different scholarly and communal organizations. He's written on many articles published in very reputable journals on the question of Islam and politics. We are honored to have him, and his participation is a gift for all of us. I will first turn it over to Dr. Ovamir Anjum. Professor Anjum?
All right. Anybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Good morning, evening, night, whoever you are. It is a pleasure and honor to be speaking at this conference on the Ummah, Islam and Global Affairs, and particularly in the company of such esteemed panelists and friends. And so I am going to do my best to not go over. And my topic is recalling the Caliphate, and especially the challenge of institutions. Now, I did not choose my title, but I am pleased with it because I think that Recalling the Caliphate, of course, is the title of a very important book that came out a few years ago by Professor Salman Syed, who very courageously tried to create a psychological space for thinking about the affairs of the Ummah in a new register. And that was a book that I have taught and I've learned from, as well as some other works that have come out. But Recalling the Caliphate, I think, does one very important thing, which I want to focus on today, which is that it focuses not on institutions, not on a path toward establishing the Caliphate, not legal theories of the Caliphate, not the obligations, religious or theological, but rather on the problem of imagination. Can we think as an ummah? And what are the hurdles? What are the obstacles of imagination that confront us when we think about the ummah? And why is it that when we try to wrestle our way out of Westernese, as he calls it, the language of the nation state, constitutionalism, democracy, human rights, all of those can be good and bad things, but nonetheless, this language that defines our aspirations, our imagination, it fails something very important about what it means to be the Ummah. And I want to talk about this question of imagination. So first point I want to make is that we as human beings always aspire to things that we cannot fully achieve. Things that we have achieved are not worth aspiring to. And this is true of people who call themselves secular, and it's true for people who call themselves religious. As Muslim believers, we aspire not to commit sins. We are told not to commit sins, not even go close to them. Yet at the same time, we know that in fact we commit sins, we fail before God day and night. Yet a realistic figure, I mean, you can imagine an Enlightenment figure sitting in the 19th century and saying that is an enormously foolish idea to spend your day and night thinking about achieving a goal that you at the same time are absolutely sure you will not achieve. That you will in fact never live a life without committing sins. So why do you not sort of figure out a different paradigm of life? And that to some degree was the fundamental move of modernity, of modern imagination. Let's reach for things that we can in fact achieve and attain in this very life. And either deny or at least set aside for public discussion, for public affairs, for all practical purposes, discussion of matters that are beyond our reach. Yet we find that in fact that has never been the case, and there is not only that we do not have any hope that that will be the case, that we will aspire to ideals only those that we have achieved, but in fact, we positively do not want to. In fact, the more world seems to become vacant of the divine, the more polytheistic or pantheistic it becomes. The more human beings seem to want to worship everything and anything that moves. And I'm referring here to books such as The Myth of Disenchantment by Professor Joseph Sunstorm, and many others that show this aspiration to things not so much that are impossible, but rather our aspiration for things that we know we cannot fully achieve. This is also true of democracy. This is also true of constitutionalism or liberalism. So for instance, you find that our best theorists of democracy, Sheldon Wallen, many others, effectively argue that democracy is a fugitive, meaning that it's always on the run. Democracy is a moment in the life of a nation or a people, that there are moments when their will in fact is materialized, and then that moment disappears. And whether it's between the elections or when elections themselves are felt to be controlled by corporate powers and so on, yet we do not stop calling ourselves democracy. We do not stop imagining that there could be another democratic moment. We do not stop aspiring to it. When democracy delivers rotten eggs to us, right? We in fact hope and aspire that another moment of democracy will give us something better. When we realize that democracy will never be able to solve, for instance, the problem of the global climate change, that in fact the vast majority of human beings will not plan for the next 50 years, and that the basic rhythm of the planet on which we live is measured in decades and centuries, for which a democratic system cannot plan without curtailing fundamentally democracy through other means. Yet many of us aspire to democracy, and we live in what I have called in my article on the question of the caliphate, an asymptotic relationship, meaning it's like a curve that we are always getting close to, but we never meet. And in fact, perhaps the metaphor isn't quite perfect because we're not always getting even close to it, but at least in our imagination, it's always within reach, and it's worth living for. It's worth failing in and through and being failed by, and yet going back to it as an ideal. That, I think, is what truly defines one's religiosity. So in my view, people who use democracy as a tool are not really committed to democracy. The true Democrats are those who know that it's going to fail, yet they're going to live by the aspiration, by the dream of democracy. Now this, I argue, has been true of all our ideals. So you can say that about liberalism. In fact, you can say that about capitalism. A system that on the one hand governs us, but if you apply any theoretically any definition of capitalism, except one that merely is an empirical description of facts, our system in some ways violates it. But if you ask to any libertarian, they will swear by capitalism, and that all the problems that they are encountering is because capitalism has not been properly applied. So my point here is that we as Muslim intellectuals, Muslim thinkers, have been captives of imagination, imposed imagination, but one nonetheless, as Ibn Khaldun foresaw after a self-imposed defeat, Muslims also imposed a self-imposed, if you will, exile on our own imagination. And so I want to challenge this iron cage of certain alien paradigms. And I do not mean the paradigm of modernity or paradigm of reform, but a set of paradigms that are not false, but rather as paradigms, they become crippling to our imagination. So for example, let's look at the paradigm in which many Muslim thinkers have thought of themselves. It's either the paradigm, for example, of religious reform, which could be the reform understood as Protestant reform, a kind of reformism, in which the discussion was about taqlid and ijtihad, and that we were not doing enough ijtihad. We could also think of it and turn it around and answer that question by saying, in fact, taqlid was great. So now the paradigm is turned upside down, and going back to an imagined romanticized tradition then becomes the paradigm through which we look at all of the problems. And there is more recently, the dominant paradigm is a security paradigm, that after 9/11 in particular, it has become the dominant paradigm through which our elite imagine and argue and negotiate and place themselves. So how many Muslim intellectuals, as well as particularly Muslim elite, think of themselves and present themselves to the world is, well, we are better than the alternative, which is going to be to promote terrorism or is going to be bad for the West in one way or another. So I do not want to dismiss the importance of these paradigms and these experiences that are important to learn from. But I think that for a number of reasons, these paradigms, particularly the nation state paradigm, has had such a hold on Muslim imagination that it was seen as the air in which we live, that we cannot imagine living another way. And even the very possibility that today we can have a conference about this issue, and it has become a problem that we can discuss, is the result of almost 3 decades of globalization in which many Muslim intellectuals have experienced the world in a new way. Most people on this panel have experienced something like that they live in a different place they were born in, that they no longer can take the protections of the nation state for granted, or somehow vicariously feel through their scholarship or activism or friendships the problems of a globalizing world, but nonetheless benefit from that globalization. So I do not mean to say that what I am doing, what we are doing here is truly groundbreaking, because in some ways we are in the late stage of globalization, thinking about why is it that we took these things such as the nation state for granted for so long. Now, that said, I think we have agency. It's hard to see, it's hard to detect, but I think and I believe we have agency. And it's a matter of faith. It's not something that one can demonstrate empirically. And it is because of that faith that I think that what we do and say matters. That in fact, we can look at our condition and do better thinking than we have been doing, and engage in better kind of collective action than we have been engaging. And so the Caliphate to me is the name for that imagination. It's not a particular medieval institution that with absolutist power accorded to one strong man, but as I have discussed this in my article, and I am continuously engaged with Muslim scholars, in fact, as well as non-Muslim scholars, in imagining and thinking about what the Caliphate could be in the future. But even if it is a political institution one day, it will also need to be a place in imagination. And as the classical Caliphate discourse, which is at the heart of Sunni orthodoxy, has in fact been in the books, whether it has been a discourse that has evolved and grown, whether that imaginate and has filled our imagination enough or not, that's a different question. I argue in my book that perhaps that discourse has fallen short in providing that full richness of Muslim imagination. But nonetheless, over the last century, that imagination, I think, has shriveled. And especially in the last couple of decades in the age of the nation state, then after the Second World War and then globalization, Muslims have been scared to think in, and I think that even after, assuming that such an institution or some kind of institution will be established or can be established, there needs to be a place in our imagination collectively as Muslims that can critique that institution to become better, because it will always be an asymptotic ideal. And therefore, even those organizations, people's thinkers who have talked about the Caliphate as a set of legal institutions, I think, while having done important work, have missed out a very important part of imagination, the imagination of the Caliphate as a Muslim, as an Islamic imagination. And this imagination is grounded in, of course, I believe, the Quran itself, kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas, that imagination of an ummah that has a global existence, that has an existence for humankind, yet also it has an internal order in that it is khayra ummah, it is the best of communities. It's best community because it upholds a faith and aqidah and a set of practices that are dear to God. And it has a world, a view to the world outside. This means that one constantly needs to engage in evaluating whether the institutions that we have come up with at any given time are, they hold up to that ideal. And being a community of aspirations, being a community where our ethics are very comfortable being ideal, where we aspire to be like the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam, while also knowing that we can never fully be like that. I think that we should safely conclude that elaborating that imagination, making it worthwhile, and drawing out its implications in various stages of, if you will, the evolution of that caliphate as an institution before, after, while it's undergoing crises, when it turns out that it's not quite what we wanted it to be, that there will be a way to think about the ummah. And in the same way, again, I'm not asking for something and I'm not positing something that hasn't existed in the past. So it is very much a continuation of some of the best work that has been done by our ulama in the past, and to go back and engage in it. We can think about constitutionalism, we can think about democracy. We may even succumb to the temptations of the modern nation state and our part of the pond for the time being. But I am persuaded, as a historian and a political thinker, that those will be all short-lived pleasures, that ultimately you will have to worry about Muslims globally, and you will have to worry about the fact that the ummah cannot be confined. And so I think that the task of creating this caliphate of imagination, a discourse that is not tied to and is not, cannot be bought by, cannot be controlled and manipulated by particular institutions and conglomerations of power, but one that lives very close to the discourse on Islamic aqidah, Islamic law, Islamic orthodoxy, just the way that people, Muslims, for instance, are used to manuals of law and tahara and salah and zakat. We ought to also think about what it means to be an ummah and to be governed in a way that is just, and to govern in a way that is responsible and just. And the ummah ultimately is the name of not a national ummah in this or that nation state, but the ummah of all Muslims.
So Anjum, we've got one or two more minutes. Good.
All right, no, I'm done. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Anjum, for inviting us to think about or expanding our imagination. Our next participant is Professor Andrew March from University of Massachusetts. Professor March is the Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts. He's written two books. One is Islam and Liberal Citizenship, which was awarded for excellence at the study of religion, and for the study of religion at the American Academy of Religion. The second is The Caliphate of Man, his new book. He is presently interested in trends in Islamic political thought and after the anti-democratic counter-revolutions, which ended the Arab Spring, and the political philosophy underpinning the ideology of Muslim democracy. Professor March.
Thank you, Owais, for that very, very generous introduction. Thank you, Dr. Sami, for the invitation to participate. Delighted to be able to speak. Unfortunately, it can't be in Istanbul this time, but perhaps in a future post-vaccine year. Amma ba'ad. So I am going to speak a little bit today about my new book, The Caliphate of Man, Popular Sovereignty and Modern Islamic Thought. This book is a study of the development of a particular political theology in modern Islamic thought that grounds a doctrinal commitment to a form of popular sovereignty and the Quranic claim that God has created a caliph on earth. My book argues that this vision of popular sovereignty is not merely a superficial apologetic move designed to refute claims that, quote, Islam is not compatible with democracy, but rather reflects a genuine intellectual revolution in modern Islamic thought. This revolution consists in a move away from a view of politics as just guardianship and pious representation by rulers and scholars together, to a distinctive vision of democracy whereby a just and pious people governs itself while also representing God's instructions to humanity. This intellectual revolution involved more than political pragmatism or superficial adoption of democratic language. It consisted in a comprehensive reformulation of Islamic political philosophy, built in particular on a theological claim about mankind's status as God's vicegerent or caliph on earth. That reformulation involved not only reducing rulers to their proper status as agents or wukala of the people, but also implicitly raising the people to the ultimate arbiters of God's law in its application in particular circumstances. My claim is that if Islamism as a political theology represents a grand idea, one that is meant to challenge and replace others in the modern Muslim public sphere, it is this. My book seeks to explore this ideal, where it came from, and what were its theoretical conditions of possibility. But in the wake of the authoritarian counter-revolutions after the Arab Spring, I also ask whether this ideal theory of a kind of Islamic democracy is now a matter of history and merely intellectual history at that. And if so, does this not leave Islamists with a kind of intellectual crisis as they seek to define what distinctive approach to political life Islam has to offer? In the first order, my book seeks to take seriously the aspiration to theorize comprehensively the fusion of divine and popular sovereignty. What does it mean to hold that both God and the people can be said to be sovereign? Imperatives of the divine and the popular, the theocratic and the democratic, often speak in different voices. But a core thesis of my analysis is that the divine and popular elements in Islamic democratic theory are often derived from the same commitments and materials. Divine command is not just a constraint on human freedom, and human freedom is not just the absence of divine command. Rather, the foundation of Islamic democratic theory is the same as the foundation of Islamic theocratic theory. That foundation is the relationship between divine address and the divine delegation. The political theology of popular sovereignty in Islam is that the Ummah has been entrusted by God with the realization of his law on earth. God is the principal agent and actor, and the first response of the people as deputy or as caliph is a passive and receptive one. But the force of God dignifying mankind as his caliph is that he has deputized no one else in between God and man. No kings, no priests, no scholars. Adherence to the covenant of vicegerency is also synonymous with human virtue and perfection. But above all, the idea of the universal caliphate of mankind points beyond the mere fulfillment of the law to the popular creation of the law, the ultimate marker of sovereignty. But this ideal leaves unresolved certain paradoxes and uncertainties. Which specific aspects or powers of sovereignty are the, quote, people said to enjoy? Are they fully sovereign powers or are they constrained? What are the implications for traditional conceptions of the divine law and those agents who claim to represent it, the ulama? What kind of, quote, people is imagined to be sovereign? What are the conditions for it to claim this authority? And how is this sovereignty represented and enacted? In my analysis, the attempt to answer these questions at a theoretical level reaches its apotheosis in the pre-2011 thought of figures like Rashid al-Ghannouchi. Ghannouchi's views are complex, and I cannot summarize them entirely here. This is the subject of chapter 6 of my book. But on my reading, the core aspiration of Islamic democratic theory is to theorize an ideal regime type based on a people that is sovereign in its control over political institutions, but at the same time not radically free to legislate for itself, but is rather constrained by divine command. This theory culminates, however, in more than a mere political supremacy for the people, but also in a kind of legislative sovereignty. In this ideal theory, the Ummah can be seen as the, quote, source of legislation, masdar al-tashri'ah, and not merely masdar al-siyasiyya, because while God is the primary and original source of legislation, the Ummah participates in divine will through its public practice of mutual consultation. What holds together this imagination that divine sovereignty can be realized as popular sovereignty? Divine sovereignty as a pre-political law embodied in text, constraining political life, only comes to life through a particular kind of collective and individual popular agency. This is an agency built on moral and epistemic commitment to fulfilling the covenant of vicegerency. The theory of popular sovereignty, envisioned by the Caliphate of Man, is as a kind of republic of virtue, and that it presupposes a people that is both united morally around a shared conception of truth and committed both epistemically and practically to seeing politics as the realization of the divine trust to be faithful to God and pursue the Ummah's legitimate worldly interests or masalih.
I couldn't hear what you said.
My hope is that my book will have the effect of making central the theology of the universal caliphate to scholarly discussions of modern Islamic political theory. I also hope that my book moves discussions of, quote, Islam and democracy beyond questions of compatibility or incompatibility toward more detailed considerations of the variety of forms of democratic theory and the conditions of possibility for specific democratic regimes to be realized. In addition, there are a few other themes from the book that I would like to bring separate attention to, especially now that it has become so common for Islamist thinkers to shift their attention from the ideal of a thoroughgoing Islamic democracy to a more modest ideology of, quote, Muslim democracy. As the intellectual tradition of democratic Islamism developed in an ideal form during the decades of exile from power, destined to remain just that, an ideal theory forming an intellectual tradition rather than an actually realizable regime type. One preliminary observation may be that insofar as the ideal regime type of an Islamic democracy is a kind of republicanism, it confronts many of the obstacles faced by all forms of republicanism. The notion that republicanism demands too much of ordinary citizens by way of participation, knowledge, and virtue is precisely the source of the modern view that popular sovereignty can only be expressed through exceptional moments of constituent power, leaving government to elected representatives. Moreover, it places a faith in politics and the state that is simply absent in most modern societies, particularly in most Muslim ones that have high levels of alienation from the state and ruling oligarchies. But I would like to conclude by raising what I consider the single most important moral factor that makes a specific vision of an Islamic democracy likely to remain at the level of an ideal, what I refer to in my book as the irreversible moral pluralism of modernity. Modern Islamist political thought attempts to repurpose classical Islamic legal concepts for a modern structural and institutional context. One first tension between the core assumptions of this project and modern sociological realities in Muslim societies is that Muslim majority societies are characterized by the same fundamental challenge of pluralism as other modern societies. it may be true that, that this is quoting Wa'il Halak, that for the great majority of Muslims today, the Sharia remains a source of religious and moral authority. That may be true, or it may not be, but Muslims disagree radically on what this implies and who they want to speak in the name of the Sharia. For many, including perhaps Halak, this kind of pluralism is itself a tragedy that Muslims only have to face because of colonialism. But if it is true that a genuinely Islamic popular constituent moment is an impossibility today, that is more likely to be because of the combination of moral pluralism in Muslim societies and the inadequacy of the pre-modern Islamic legal ahkam, not principles, for most social and economic policy areas. In modernity, there is reasonable disagreement about ethics, even from Muslims or those living in Muslim countries. This is a fact that cleaves the idea of an Islamic popular constituent power in two. Either a given people is free to choose whatever form of government it wishes, in which case Islamic legal theory has little to say, or the freedom of the constituent moment is usurped by prior constraints of fidelity to some pre-political Islamic social contract. I would submit that this is particularly a problem for modern Islamic political thought precisely because of its aspiration to deep legality, Shari'ah. Although much modern commentary has focused on the problem of, quote, Islam and violence, the more accurate story, in my opinion, is that the modern Islamist vision is, though not pacifist, one of consensus as the deep foundation of politics. From Rashid Rida's preoccupation with refounding the caliphate on purely consensual grounds, to Ghanouchi's vision of a people that sees itself as God's caliph, enacting a kind of dual social contract between God and then it and its government. Modern Islamism shares with certain kinds of liberalism precisely an embarrassment at the violent origins of politics and the violence needed to sustain it. Even the utopianism of Sayyid Qutb, arguably responsible for the ease with which some more radical Islamist groups have rationalized violence, structures his reflections around a humanity that might well be conceived as born free, that is, in its innate fitri condition of monotheism and good enough moral disposition. What all these theories have in common is they're beginning by simply positing the existence of an ummah, with its essence of piety and moral unity already established.
So March, could I ask you to go a little slower because the translators are having a little bit difficulty translating.
I apologize. I'm almost done.
And you have roughly 6 more minutes.
Okay. Of course, an Islamist theory of politics could acknowledge that this ummah does not exist, but must be formed through education and coercion, as Qutbist theories do by calling for a vanguard, a tali'ah, to take power in our present fallen times. But this is simply not in the spirit of so much of modern Islamist thought before and after Qutb, which not only rejects the violence authorized against Jahiliyyah, but also tends to imagine Jahiliyyah away at the level of ideal theory. Of course, the option remains for Islamic Democrats to imagine a, quote, Islamic democracy to come. I think something in Owamir's remarks about the caliphate, right? This is something that may seem impossible now, but it's something to constantly be strived for, like any moral or ethical ideal. That is, in this example, a future sovereign ummah that can express its moral unity politically after the people has, quote, returned to its natural piety by a combination of removing the alien causes of disunity and gentle education. This is not a contradiction. Every democratic theory, if it hopes for more than managed competition or the minimalization of the evils that government can do, has to rest on a faith in the people becoming fit for self-rule. All that remains to be said is that because this Islamic democratic vision of self-rule involves a very deep kind of consensus about metaphysical truths and the ethical purposes of human life, it does not escape the possibility that such deep moral agreement is no longer likely in the contemporary world, at least without the kinds of coercion and limitation on freedoms of conscience and speech that Islamic Democrats claim to reject. So what if moral pluralism is here to stay? This may indeed be a moment when the vision of both democratizing and Islamizing the modern state finally gives way to other horizons and possibilities. When Islamizing law seems less of a panacea or even a minimal condition of legitimacy, living and acting politically in such a moment is less of a challenge, perhaps, than theorizing it. Beyond subtracting Islamist idealism, even utopianism, and accommodating political reality, what are Islamic norms adding to the political? It is possible that the most important horizon for Islamic political thought today is a post-statist, even post-sovereigntist one. This is not just an observation imposed by the theoretical structure of my book. Alongside the claims to have moved into post-Islamism or Muslim democracy, there is a nascent discourse on Islam in the political after the state. Although this may require a new generation of thinkers, it may also be a horizon that traditional Islamist thinkers themselves are best equipped to observe. This is not only because they are best acquainted with the difficulty of realizing a fully Islamic public sphere, but also because they are some of the greatest witnesses of the brutality and danger of state power. Ghannouchi himself, while observing the inherent authoritarianism of any state, even an Islamic one, when it holds the society and the economy in its grip, holds that the post-statist, post-sovereigntist Islamic vision may be one that focuses on society as a space for expanding the freedom from state tyranny for a variety of ways of life, not only religious, but also materialist, secular ones. There is something of a kind of liberalism of fear to this insight. Islamists like Ghannouchi have experienced more than their share of the awful and tyrannical power the state is capable of. And so limiting that power, not only for the sake of the ordinary goods of nonviolence and non-domination, but for the freedom for religious ways of life to be able to flourish, is less a theoretical doctrinal achievement than one earned by the practical political experience of opposition to authoritarianism. In my view, this potentially heralds an Islamic political thought in a new register, a political Islamic political thought, one that is informed both by the political as its own domain of pluralism and novelty, and also by Islamist reflection on their cumulative historical experience of political action. There need be no preset script for this register of thought, liberal, theocratic, or otherwise, but it may take place without the fantasy of total political sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. March. I will move along and we will address the questions together that are coming through the social media once all the speakers have completed their talks. Next, we have Dr. Rafik Abdessalem from the Center of Strategic and Diplomatic Studies, Tunisia. Dr. Abdessalem has his PhD in Politics and International Relations from the University of Westminster. He founded the Maghreb Center for Research and Translation in the UK and chaired the London Platform for Dialogue. He was a visiting scholar at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies. He has worked with many media platforms, and he has also published 2 books. One of them is titled In Religion, Secularism and Democracy, and the other one, United States of America, Between Hard Power and Soft Power. Currently, he is the director of the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies in Tunisia. Professor Abdessalem, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Han. Thank you, Dr. Sami, for providing this opportunity. Thank you for the Center for Islamic and Global Affairs to provide such an opportunity for this variety of intellectuals and thinkers from different, parts of the world to speak about the political theory, the Islamic political theory, as well the concrete reality of the Muslim world. I try to be brief and try also to express myself in English, as my English is not very fluent, but I'll try to do my best. I'm going to focus more on the political aspect of the Tunisian democracy more than the intellectual or theoretical or theological debate. I think there is a lot of debate about the issue of democracy and democratization in the Muslim world that is mainly focused on the theoretical and theological level. And the main questions are mostly raised here is whether democracy is compatible with Islam or not, whether the religion of Islam can adapt and accept liberal democracy or not. And I think this is the dominant narratives or the dominant questions that are raised within the liberal circles as well, even within the Islamic circles, whether Islam is compatible with democracy, with the values and principles of democracy or not. And I think the missing point concerns the reality of democracy, not theories or hypotheses, and the complexity of the project of democratization and the obstacles that confront it on the ground. And I think since the 19th century, the dominant Islamic discourse has accepted democracy, including what is called mainstream political Islam. Since Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, Mohamed Abdu, Rashid Rida in Egypt and the eastern part of the Arab world, as well, Tahir bin Ashur, Ala al-Fasi in North Africa, in Tunisia and Morocco, the general tendency were in favor of accepting the norms and mechanism of democracy based on pragmatic reasons, or sometimes even by reinterpreting the Islamic doctrine or Islamic legacy by reading democracy as shura. It seems to me the main challenges that are facing democratization, the main challenges that are facing the region is a democratization not coming neither from Islam nor democracy in itself, Islam or democracy per se, but from the concrete reality, the geopolitical conditions and the local conditions of the Muslim countries. That is why there is a need to shift the questions and the focus from the theological and theoretical aspect to the concrete reality on the ground on the Muslim world. It is obvious that the MENA region, if I use this term, or the Muslim world, generally speaking, is going back to authoritarianism. In 2012, the Arab Spring opened the prospect of democratization and created a general perception that political despotism is in decline. So, the political despotism is in decline and being challenged by popular mobilization and protest on the streets of Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, and Syria. This shattered the dominant narrative that the Arab region is stagnant and Arabs are not interested in democracy or freedom. But unfortunately, since 2013, we have seen a strong wave of counter-revolution after the military coup in Egypt. With the exception of Tunisia, Arab Spring, countries are now under military rule or living through civil war and chaos like Syria, Libya, Yemen. What created this complexity and difficulty in these countries are the internal factors as well the regional elements, political divisions as well regional intervention. Challenges of democratic transition. In spite of all the challenges that we faced in the past and face today, Tunisia remains a success story compared to other Arab Spring countries. Tunisia is still on track. Of course, the situation is not ideal. It's not, ideal, but it's still manageable. This does not mean that the situation is perfect in Tunisia, but at least it is better than other countries of the region and comparably to what is called the Arab Spring countries. On the political level, we have made, here in Tunisia, very good progress. We managed in a relatively short time and amidst very difficult and local and regional conditions to draft a progressive constitution and to organize a free and transparent elections, 2011, then in 2014, and the last election, 2019. And before that, we succeed to organize unprecedented local election that set up the foundations of local governance. Tunisians enjoy a wide scope for freedom, unprecedented in their modern history. Freedom of organization, expression, press, and media. What makes Tunisia an exception in its journey for democratization, I think a number of key factors have made these achievements possible. The first element, the homogeneity of the Tunisian society, not in the sense of absence of the diversity. I use the term homogeneity in a positive connotation, but in the sense of absence of sectarian and ethnic divisions. The differences between Tunisians remain within the spectrum of political and ideology and do not turn into ethnic or religious divides in the way that we have seen in many Arabic or Islamic countries like Syria, Iraq, Lebanon. The second element, the Tunisian army, the legacy of the neutrality of the military institutions. The Tunisian army does not have a legacy of intervening in politics. Since the independence, Bourguiba, the previous, the founding father of independence, Habib Bourguiba, was suspicious about Ba'athism in Iraq and Syria and Nasserism in Egypt. He was determined to keep the army out of politics in its barracks. This gave a civil character, a civil nature of the Tunisian state. The third element, I think Tunisian political life has been ready for democratization for many decades. We have a strong political traditions with a dynamic civil society as well as strong trade unions and political parties, even though they were weakened under the regime of Ben Ali. When we have a political crisis in 2013, it was the civil society which intervened crisis. It was the military institution who intervened and to sort out the crisis based on its own terms and interests. The fourth element, the rationality of political actors. Since 2011 elections, we have tried to manage political life through the logic of power sharing rather than monopolization, and have sought to avoid zero-sum equations. I think the coexistence and cohabitation between what is called moderate Islamists and moderate secularists is one of the foundations, one of the pillars of the success of the Tunisian democracy compared to other Arab Spring countries. And I think it would be impossible to imagine the success of Tunisia politically without the key role played by Nahda party as a whole and its leader, Rashid al-Ghannouchi, specifically. When we faced severe political deadlock in 2013, we chose consensus rather than conflict. We ceded power to a caretaker government in order to safeguard democracy, completing the drafting of the constitution and hold elections. And then we accepted to participate in the coalition government within the limited number of a junior minister in order to safeguard the democratic process. I mean, this is for a Nahda party. In 2011, it was the vanguard political party, which, you know, was engaged in building the process of democratization. And 2013, Nahda became the second political party, and it accepted to be engaged and included within the political process based on power sharing with Nida Tunis and other political party within a coalition government. But I think the Tunisian experience, the Tunisian nascent democracy, still facing many difficulties and even shortcomings. The first element, we are not immune, I mean, as Tunisian, to the political crisis and conflicts in the region, particularly since we have a civil war in on our southern borders with Libya. Tunisian situation will remain fragile as long as there is no political resolution in the neighboring country in Libya. We are living in a very fragile regional environment. I think Tunisia was deeply affected by the political crisis in Libya, which was transformed in military conflict. And this has affected the country on the security level as well, political and economical dimension. As I said, we are not immune from the political crisis and conflict in the region, particularly the crisis in Libya. And I think the other element is regional intervention. It is not secret that there is a strong regional axis led by the Saudi Arabia and Egypt after the coup d'etat in Egypt tried to destabilize the nascent democracy in Tunisia to consolidate its narrative that democracy is not functioning in the Arab world. And even that democracy is the source of all crises and problems in the region, and the best way to go back to the era of Ben Ali and Mubarak, which is seen as comparable to the post-Arab Spring, is seen as better situation. The third element, I think the threat of terrorism is another problem. It's not only a local problem, but it's becoming a regional and international problem. And I think there is no country which is immune 100% from the threat and challenge of terrorism. During the last few years, we have some serious terrorist attacks in Tunis, the capital, as well in Bardo, that destabilize the country. But I think there is a good progress in terms of the efficiency of the security forces, and I think the country manage and control the threat of terrorism. The fourth element is that political progress has unfortunately not been matched on the economic level. There is a huge gap between people's aspirations and the state's capabilities. And I think there is a huge gap between the aspirations of the people and the concrete reality of the country. And this has created a lot of tension and problems, mainly within the marginal sectors of the society and the inner cities where the revolution was declenched. Those who rose up in the inner cities may enjoy more freedom than in the past, but the quality of their lives has not improved much. There is still a high rate of unemployment, more than 15%, and now within the COVID-19 crisis, it will reach 18% unemployment, and 30%, and even more now within the COVID crisis, of unemployment within the graduates, within graduate people. There has not been much improvement in infrastructure, education, healthcare, or transport. A genuine democracy could only function on two pillars, political and economic. So we made a good progress on the political perspective. As I said before, we succeed to draft the constitution, to organize free and transparent elections. The principle of alteration of power is consolidating itself on the ground. And I think the Tunisians as a whole, Tunisians are enjoying more freedom compared to any other countries in the region. But economically speaking, you know, the progress is still limited one. And this is what created the tension and the crisis in the country. And as I said before, a genuine democracy could only functions on two pillars, political one as well economic. And I think Tunisia is still trying to find the right balance between freedom and security. It is easier to bring down despotic regime than it is to build a democracy. But in spite of all the challenges and difficulties, Tunisia still has a potential for a great success. I think Tunisia is still a journey and an experience of success more than a failure. Democracy, of course, is not necessarily the magical solution for all problems, but I think it is not possible to build a real and solid stability without democracy and freedom of the population. And I think if we succeed, and we have a great chance of success, at least we have the ability to shatter the old postulate that democracy is not functioning in the Arab world. And if we succeed, at least we send a positive message to the region as a whole, that democracy is possible, and a genuine democracy could function in the Arab world and the Islamic region as a whole. And I think I have to stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Abdessalem. Your also not just theoretical, but experiential commentary on the recent history of Tunisia is quite enlightening. I will now introduce our last speaker, Dr. Mohamed Shingiti from the University of Qatar. He is quite prolific, both in Arabic and in English. In Arabic, he's written a massive book on the constitutional crisis of Islamic civilization. He's also written many monographs on early Islamic political history, and he has written in English a research dissertation on Sunni-Shia relations, as well as the early history of African Americans, just to name a few of his works. I think one of the most interesting ones is that he is also a published poet. I invite Dr. Shingiti to make his remarks on Islamic constitutionalism.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Sami and the Center for this opportunity. I want to divide my intervention into two parts, one theoretical and one will focus on the Islamic constitutionalism from a global comparative perspective. On a theoretical level, I have a few remarks. Number one is that the essence of what we call today Islamic constitutionalism. Can you hear me, please?
Yeah.
No? Yes, we hear you.
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, sounds good. I think the essence of Islamic constitutionalism is the possibility.
Can I interrupt you?
Yes, go ahead, please.
At the bottom of your screen, there's an interpretation.
There is what?
There's an interpretation button. If you could please click on it and go on the English channel.
Where is that? I'm using my iPhone.
I don't think there's the option for that on your iPhone.
No,
There is no.
Is there?
There is more option. Can you see more option?
Yeah, more. Okay.
Yeah, go to the interpretation and select English.
Language interpretation, English. Okay.
And then press done.
Okay. How is it now?
Oh, fine.
Good. Sorry. Let me claim my time and start over, please.
Yep.
Well, the essence of Islamic constitutionalism, as I understand it, is the search for possibility of a democracy without secularism. And this very hard debate in many Muslim countries today, and also within the academia everywhere. And I think I'm arguing here that that is really a possibility. I think it's not only a possibility, but I believe that's the only way out in the Muslim majority countries, or at least many of those Muslim majority countries. But to come to some kind of historic compromise and understanding on this, I think there is a need for some change in the approaches that usually used to study the issue of Islamic constitutionalism. Usually, it is seen as a legal issue, a political issue, but I think we need more than that to put this debate of Islamic constitutionalism within the right context. At first, I think we need to use the approach of philosophy of religion. And this is something that I like as a student of the history of religion. I believe we should not deal with all religion the same way. I think like what Nozick is talking about, minimal state, I think there are minimal religions also and maximal religions. From the point of view of philosophy of religion, every religion has to have at least 3 components to be called religion: a belief, worship, and some kind of cosmic narrative, some kind of a story about the origin and the meaning of life and feature of human beings, etc. So these are the minimal component of any religion. So what I will call here the minimal religions are religions who have only this kind of element. Some religions have more. They have a moral system, for example, but some religions have much more than that. And I think the way some researchers are dealing with this issue, talking about religion in general, as humanity has only one kind of religion, one type of religion, I think it's wrong. I think we need to distinguish between religion based on their own component, the way philosophers of religion do. From this standpoint, Islam, I'm sorry, I have to use my charger. 1 second. Okay, just to be on the safe side, I needed to use this. Okay, from this perspective, I think as Ali Izzat Begovic says in his book, Islam Between East and West, he said that Islam is a worldly religion, that for a religion to change the world, it needs to be worldly. So, and he said Islam is a worldly religion. I mean, it's a practical religion. It's not only uh, uh, about ideals, it's also about practical ethicality or ethical practicality. And another very important idea of Ali Izzat is when he talked about Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said there is always difficulty for Christian culture to understand the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because in Islam, a perfect human stays a human, and a prophet as a perfect man for Muslims, perfect human, he stays as a human. So, and that's not easy to understand if you come from a background of incarnation or Son of God or that kind of theological perspective. So I think if we distinguish between religion based on this minimal, maximal division, like the way Nozick talk about minimal state, for example, we can have more clarity about the importance of Islamic constitutionalism, or to put it more clear, the importance for Muslims of a democracy without secularism. The second approach I think that is needed also is philosophy of history, not only philosophy of religion, but there is need for more philosophy of history to study the relation between Islam and politics and what happened to the political ideals in Islam. I try to contribute in my book on the constitutional crisis of Islamic civilization, that is not translated into English yet, unfortunately. And I talk about the Arabian anarchism and the Persian monarchism as two factors that did not allow the Islamic political value to grow. And I'm using here the Hegel's ideas of what we translate into Arabic as al-imkan al-tarihi, or the historical potential. So the Islamic political historical potential was not realized fully, at least because of these Arabian anarchism and Persian monarchism as a historical factors. So that might help us also to understand the problem of politics in Islam historically. And it's a problem that didn't start today with the modern state, as some friends might look at it. Also, I think the Islamic constitutionalism needs to be approached from a point of view of collective self-determination. And I think Professor Andrew Marsh put it very eloquently when he talked about this rule of God versus rule of man. And I would add to that a remark of Mohamed Iqbal when he talked about end of prophethood or Khatm al-Risala. And he sees this idea of Khatm al-Risala as an announcement that human beings, as the collective will of human beings, can now carry the divine message. So we can carry the divine message through our collective will, instead of having a prophet who's carrying this divine message. So Ahmed Iqbal is interpreting the idea of end of prophethood in Islam, or the Khatm al-Risala, in this way. And I think that's very important and a very revolutionizing idea if we look at it in this context of Islamic democracy and Islamic constitutionalism. Of course, there is concern always in the modern secular mind about the clergy. But I want to say just a funny story. When I was a member of a committee of interfaith committee in Texas a few years ago, many years ago actually, I was asked in one of the churches, what's the difference between Sunnis and Shia? And I said, well, the Shia are Catholic and the Sunnis are Protestant. And they laughed, my Christian friends laughed. And I said, well, I'm talking seriously, but I'm talking here in terms of structure. Yes, in terms of structure, Shia are closer to Catholicism and Sunnis are closer to Protestantism, which means in Sunni political theology, with all of the emphasis that we see in the writing of Juwayni and Ghazali and others about the importance and the position of Muslim scholars within the political system, actually, there is no clergy in that sense in Islam that can claim some kind of divine right or can give the rulers a claim of divine right in Islam. So as Ibn Taymiyyah put it actually very eloquently when he said, عصمة الأمة تغني عن عصمة الأئمة, that the infallibility of the Ummah is enough. We don't need the infallibility of the Imams. Of course, this is within his debate with the Shia theology. Another approach I think that is needed also in this context is we should look at this Islamic constitutionalism within the concept of distributive justice, not the distributive justice of economy, for example, the way John Rawls and others talk about, but the distributive justice in the sense of the moral and symbolic capital that these societies have. I mean, when society is divided about religion or about the interpretation of history, about the meaning of life, I think we can look at this also as some kind of capital that need to be distributed justly. And in this sense, we have to give some attention to the rights of majorities, not just the rights of minorities. So a few days after 9/11, I was in the US when that tragedy happens. And I was amazed that President W. Bush going to give a speech in the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. So why there is a national cathedral in the first place? I ask myself. But well, it's normal. I didn't see any religious minority in the U.S. complaining about having some kind of national cathedral, even if symbolically. Well, the last approach that I want to focus on is that we need to put Islamic constitutionalism within a comparative global perspective. And that's what I've been focusing on in the last few years. I try to collect every article in every constitution in the world that has anything to say about religion. And what I found out is just the first, that this issue of religious constitutionalism, if you want to say it that way, it's not purely an Islamic issue. And we should not, and Muslims should not take it, and I think scholars should not take it also as purely an Islamic issue. All of this debate about Islamic constitutionalism is forgetting that there are many constitutions around the world that are talking about religion also with religious bias sometimes. And this issue, I think, is need to be given more attention. For example, you might find many people complaining that some Muslim countries have official religion, but they forget that there are also constitution of non-Muslim countries who have official religion, including very well-established democracies in Central and Northern Europe. For example, among countries who have official religion, we have Argentina, Mexico, Honduras, Salvador, Malta, Monaco. These are Costa Rica, Panama. These are countries that have Catholicism as an official religion. In Western and Northern Europe, we have countries like Denmark, Iceland, Norway that recognize the Evangelical Lutheran Church specifically in their constitution as the official religion. And there are many examples that I was amazed to find out about the Christian Orthodox, or the Orthodox Christianity was also made official religion in several countries in Eastern Europe and in Balkan, for example, Greece, Bulgaria, and even some Asian countries have Buddhism as official religion, like Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Myanmar, etc. Of course, the case of Israel is well known. The base clause of Israel emphasized the character of the state as a Jewish state, and it's prevent anyone who doesn't recognize that to be a candidate to the Israeli Knesset. So the Palestinian Arab Christians or Arab Muslims have to recognize the Jewishness of Israel before being eligible to be candidate for Israeli parliament, etc. Some of people also are amazed that some Muslim countries require the head of state to be a Muslim, which is, I don't think it's a good idea. I'm against it, actually. But it's not purely an Islamic issue also. So we have the Denmark and Norway that require, for example, that the king has to be a follower of the Evangelical Lutheran Church, for example, or Cambodia or Thailand requiring that the king has to be Buddhist, for example. And there are many examples of this kind of religious language and religious reference. Christian values, for example, or pride of these values, or making these values sources of inspiration, etc. This is very common in some constitutions like Norway, Latvia, Nicaragua, Bahamas, Costa Rica, talking about Christian principle of social justice, etc., etc. Zambia in Africa prides itself to be a Christian nation. Poland and Norway emphasize the Christian heritage. Bulgarians pride themselves to be part of the Christian Europe, etc. What I want to say is there is no need to single out Muslims about this issue, or Muslims to put themselves on the defensive on this. I think it's very normal for any majority to have some say in this kind of issue. And I think that is just a part of the distributive justice. The same way if you want to build a highway that will serve 5 million people and small road that will serve just a few thousand people, and we cannot afford both of them, and we decide to have the highway instead of the other small road, for example. I think this is the challenge of a democracy, or of any democracy, always is this kind of issue of majoritarianism. So every democracy is majoritarian in some sense, but I think the way Dr. Andrew Marsh put it is much deeper than the way I'm trying to put it here, because he's taking to the source of morality and legality, and the compatibility between rule of God and rule of man in Islamic theology, at least in part of the Islamic theology. And I think if we take this kind of approach that I'm suggesting here, philosophy of religion, taking into account the philosophy of religion, philosophy of history, distributive justice, and this global comparative view of Islamic constitutionalism, there will be much better understanding of Islamic constitutionalism. And these very popular and strong tendency within Muslim societies today to have a democratic system, but a system that is rooted in Islamic values and principles. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Shingiti, for your insightful comments on Islamic constitutionalism. I will use my privilege as the moderator to ask a few questions from all of the panelists, and then open it up for discussion. This is the end of day panel for us here in Istanbul, so we can take a little bit more relaxed attitude and maybe have an open discussion between each other. Um, First, I will like to address Professor Anjum. You called Muslims to imagine the Caliphate as an ideal, right? How do you respond to the kind of thinkers that were profiled in Professor March's book? Do you feel like they have fulfilled the promise of imagining a Khalifa future, or do you feel like there is still work to be done? Um, how do you evaluate their theories, especially maybe people like Ghanouchi or Maududi or Qutb, their arguments? Do you find them to be compatible with what you're talking about, a Khalifa vision of the future? Also, I will ask you, you talked a little bit about the nation state. This is regarding, this is a question that came from our viewers, that how do we get past the question of nationalism? Is there any practical solution that you have in trying to imagine ourselves out of the nation state, as they say? And thirdly, what do we do about foreign control? Does foreign control create obstacles for our imagination of a future? These are three questions that I have for you. Professor March, I'd like to ask you, you mentioned that Islamist thinkers have a particular challenge in our day and age because of the fact of moral pluralism, that this may augment the way they think about their theories. Do you think that there's something particularly unique about the way that Muslims are facing moral pluralism in our time as opposed to the past? Are there any resources for Muslims to reach back into their past, or maybe the thinkers that you have profiled, have they considered the ways that Muslims have thought about, have dealt with pluralism in the past? Specifically, I'm thinking about, the typical conversation about, millets and such. Maybe you have something to say about that. Another issue is, how do we solve this tension between sovereignty of God and sovereignty of man? How does your thinkers respond to the kind of comments that were made by Professor Shingiti about trying to get a constitutionalism that honors both? I also noticed that you made a pretty stark distinction between the Ghanouchi pre-2011 and the Ghanouchi after 2011. My question to you is, is there some particular reason for why you studied Ghanouchi before 2011, and has his thought changed after 2011? How do you assess Dr. Rafik's progressive vision of Tunisia as a model for Muslims around the world? Professor Rafik, I want to ask you about, how would you respond to Dr. Anjum's call for a caliphate of future? How do you assess Tunisia's performance in this regard? How do you assess how the Tunisian experiment has responded to the call of the caliphate? Do you believe that Tunisia has been able to break out of the nation state constructs to which it is assigned? And you talked a lot about the freedoms that Tunisian society now enjoys after the revolution. Are there any red lines that Muslim actors in Tunisia are willing to stand for? Are there any red lines for Muslims participating in a liberal democracy, or is everything a matter of consensus? How will Muslim actors respond to, for instance, the kind of situation that we see unfolding in Palestine today, or say, for instance, certain issues that are, red lines in, say, Islamic theology or law? Lastly, Professor Shingiti, I don't know if you can hear me because your image is frozen on the screen.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. Go
Okay.
ahead.
Okay. The first question for you is, what do you say about the Wilayat al-Faqih model as for Islamic constitutionalism? I know that you studied a lot between Sunni-Shia relations. Could we imagine a Wilayat al-Faqih model minus the Shiism, or is that not possible? Why wouldn't that be a model for Muslims?
Do you mean, do you mean minus Shiism or Shiism minus Wilayat Faqih?
Yani. Interpret it as you wish.
Which one?
Another question is, I noticed that in your very uniquely in your description of Islamic constitutionalism, there was a lot of talk about the Prophet. So you spoke about, for instance, this worldly nature of the Prophet. You also spoke about his isma and the relationship that is to the community. You also talked about the end of Risala and how that is related to it. This role of the Prophet that you have highlighted here is different from a lot of what we've read by Islamic political thought actors, especially in terms of the sovereignty of God. I want to add a third element. We've spoken about the sovereignty of man, we've talked about the sovereignty of God. Is there a role for the sovereignty of prophecy or the Prophet in this three? Have you thought of that by any chance? Lastly, two more questions for you. One is, how would an Islamic state, under an Islamic constitution, on what basis would it recognize non-Muslim states? One of the advantages of the nation-state model is that because the legitimacy of that nationalism is grounded in the majoritarian religion or majoritarian culture of the people that it's supposed to stand for, it has the ability to acknowledge other states who likewise ground their legitimacy in the popular sovereignty of their respective constituents. But how would an Islamic state, who grounds its legitimacy in Islam and Muslim identity, recognize the sovereignty and legitimacy of non-Muslim states? So that's my question for you. And lastly, is that your assessment of religion and constitutions around the world really shed light on the ways in which religion is actually a normal part of legal discourse. Why is it, do you think, that Islamic constitutionalism is singled out as an exceptional threat in this regard? Why do you think that Muslim approaches to inserting Islamic norms and values into their constitutional discourse is seen exceptionally as a threat? If, in fact, as you say, religion is such a regular part, is it because maybe people think that Muslims will actually activate those clauses in their constitution as opposed to other more civilized societies in which they will have this religion in their constitution, but will obviously pass it over or may not implement it in terms of doing, implementing blasphemy, for instance, or other kinds of, religious clauses that we find in constitutions. Those are all my questions, and I incorporated into those questions a lot of the questions that came through. So now I will stop speaking, and I will open the floor. I will open it to Dr. Ovamir Anjum, and then as you feel free, I will start to ask you to participate in an open conversation. Dr. Anjum.
So thank you very much for those questions. I'll try to be as brief as possible. To evaluate Islamist thinkers of the past, Maududi, Qutb, and Ghannouchi, you mentioned. I think of Maududi and Qutb and Banna and others as visionaries who were thinking about the Islamic political problems of the mid 20th century in the age of, globally, this was the age of what is called managed capitalism or developmentalism. The birth of the nation state project in much of the Muslim world, the new fledgling states, and in some way, in terms of Muslim imagination of the world, of the globe, it was much more limited and many different from what we have today. People were much more locally grounded and thinking about their predicament locally in a way that was partly conditioned by their experience. These were people who came of age, if you will, after the Ottoman Empire. And so unlike thinkers of an earlier generation, Rashid Rida, even people like Sanhuri, these were people who could no longer take the Ottoman Empire or some kind of an ummatic imagination for granted. And given that they were thrown into a colonial situation, their first aspiration, if you will, even the dominating aspiration for people of this generation, I'm talking about Maududi, Qutb, Banna, others, Nadwi, was very much, the first problem was anti-colonial resistance, which required collective imagination, but that collective imagination was very much locally grounded in very practical problems. Now, I think that there is the last 3-4 decades produced the age of globalization since the 1980s began to produce a different kind of Islamists. So we can't really talk about, first of all, we cannot really talk about Islamists, as I have discussed this with Professor Andrew March. I don't think there is such a thing as an Islamist as a category of being or a category of thought. These are Muslims who have very different sort of basic commitments. There are very few ideas that are often found among most Islamists, but then those ideas are often shared by many significant non-Islamists, such as the role of politics in Islam. And apart from that, Islamism isn't really a thing outside of sort of analytical category for Western scholars. But that said, when we talk about people like Qutb and Maududi, we're not really, there's no really fundamental separation from what Iqbal was saying, or what Mullah Abul Kalam was saying, or Rashid Rida was saying, or Sanhuri was saying, with a few possible exceptions. And I think that Professor March's book and the question of the vicegerency of man does a good job of identifying one interesting, although not entirely distinctive, but one interesting thread. So what were these people saying vis-a-vis the caliphate? This was just beyond the scope of their imagination at the time, it seems to me. Ghannouchi is a different kind of figure. Ghannouchi, before, as Professor March says, he was someone who is thinking about Islamic democracy, and he is an heir to globalizing Islamists or globalizing reformers of the 80s and 90s, people who essentially embraced a Republican vision of Islam. They embraced the nation state. I'm talking about people like Tariq al-Bishri, Karam Abu Zaid in Egypt, and a number of other people who are writing about this stuff in the 80s and 90s. So by the time Ghannouchi comes, the Islamic political imagination in Egypt, and particularly the Arab world, is a very different place. People like Turabi are his his true teachers, not Maududi Qutb. And for Ghannouchi, Islamic democracy and nation state are, if you will, an aspiration, but one that he increasingly articulates in a very secular terms. He's influenced by his personal experience, which was not, in fact, nearly as harrowing as the vast majority of Islamists. So he, in fact, lived in London quite well. But so when he comes back, it seems that his ideas are much more influenced by Christian Democrats in Europe, and he gives up any idea of Islam or Islamism or any vision of political Islam. In fact, he simply wants power, understood in a way that he wants power as a leader who has a vision. But certainly it's not Islamism. He embraces secularism, sometimes very frankly, or some kind of liberal secularism. The only way he's different from 80s Islamists is that they were Republican and he leans more toward liberalism.
The reason I asked you, Dr. Anjum, if I would interrupt, is because the title of Dr. March's book is called Caliphate of Man. And we're talking about a caliphal vision, reinstating a caliphal vision. So I think more precisely, I think what I want to ask is, why can't we just run with the idea of Caliphate of Man? I mean, it seems like we have a running theory. I mean, we have an imagination. I mean, what's the problem? It seems like the people profiled in his book are doing the job of giving us the imagination that every person is a sovereign person, and they can be that we can ground a caliphal aspiration that way. Like that's what I'm trying to get at. I mean, what do you think about that?
Does a good job, and maybe you can talk to him about it. But obviously, he shows that this was a new vision, that was an innovation of 20th century Islamic thought, particularly in the wake of the abolition of the caliphate. Why I think that it doesn't work is because it only has an accidental relationship to the actual the caliphate as a political and nomadic ideal. The Caliphate of Man is not a political ideal. In fact, it's sort of some kind of individual or metaphysical expression about the stewardship that every person, every human being has toward God. And it's only accidentally related to the idea of the caliphate as ummah's, the governance of the ummah, the community of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is what we mean when we use the word historically, the word caliphate historically. It's the governance of the ummah, either self-governance or governance by someone that has certain legitimate characteristics.
Professor Anjum, can I ask Dr. March to jump in here? I mean, Professor March, I mean, what do you say about Professor Anjum's analysis of Ghannouchi, for instance, his return from Europe, the kinds of revolutionary changes that the Islamic Democrats brought? How do you respond? I'm making it a little bit more lively than just going.
Yes.
I'm getting
All right.
trying to
Let's
get a
get
discussion
combative.
going. So I mean,
let's get agonistic. So first of all, let me just say at the end. So I disagree with Mohamed very, very strongly that it's not a political vision. It's an intensely political vision, because it is precisely about the foundations of political order. So it says that that the primary recipient of khitab ilahi, right, the divine address, is the ummah. So that's one point, and that concomitant with that, the primary recipient of the agency to establish political authority, to authorize political offices, and to bring about the divine commands and edicts that God is addressing with, befalls the ummah collectively. Now, Ovamir is right that there is an individual and a collective component to this, right? And this perhaps gets back to what Dr. Shingiti was saying earlier about a certain kind of Protestantism within Sunni Islam, that there are no, let's say, ontologically constituted intermediaries between individuals and the text. There is a direct relationship to the text. Of course, there are scholars, there are theologians, there are experts, but they derive their authority consensually from the recognition of the people, and not because they have some divinely established intermediary status. So, the whole point, in fact, the criticism, I think, might be more appropriately directed the other way, that this idea of the universal caliphate is entirely a political conception, that because it's motivated by political concerns, that it takes its lead from political exigencies, and therefore the theology and perhaps the psychology or the metaphysics is thinner. I'm not endorsing that claim, but I think it would be a more plausible one than saying that the caliphate, that the universal caliphate, the idea that the ummah is God's khalifa, is not a political argument. I think it begins with the politics. Now, it doesn't mean it doesn't have problems. Any conception of popular sovereignty has problems because the people is not an individual agent, it's a collective agent. So identifying where it is, how it acts, where its unity is, all of these, the classic problems of any kind of popular sovereignty or democratic theory. Now, I think that you were asking a slightly different question, which is related to your third question from me, which are some of the differences between Ghannouchi before 2011 and Ghannouchi afterwards. Now, I would defer to my friend Rafik here, but I want to be very, very careful in how I speak about that, right? Because if you read Ghannouchi's essays from the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s, you can find a lot of the same themes, okay? Let's say the non-absolutist or the non-sovereigntist themes in which democracy is about pluralism. This trope that rather than the universal caliphate, but this idea that Medina, right, the Sahifat al-Medina is the arch model for politics. And here what they mean by Medina is not Deen wa Dawla, but pluralism as the center of political origins in Islam, right? This is a very, very common trope. Not just Ghannouchi, but many, many people that will say, if you look at the original Sahifa, the Prophet made a covenant with Jews and others around certain kinds of worldly goods. And this is a model for thinking about politics as where pluralism is foundational and is the origin of the Islamic political experience. Now, this is the theme that is most prominent after 2011, but you can find this before as well. So I don't want to say that Ghannouchi has this one set of ideal views and then boom, politics hits with the Constituent Assembly, and all of a sudden he discovers these other kinds of more post-Islamist or Muslim democratic ideas. Rather, what I would like to say is that both sets of ideas exist on different registers. So if you're looking at a speech or a khutbah or something like this, in which you're speaking to a popular audience, how should we think about democracy? How should we think about political cooperation with Ben Ali or with communists or with secularists? Then you find these ideas. But when you sit down to write a large treatise like Hurriyat al-Amma fi Dawla al-Islamiyya, then you get a robust elaboration of much more complex ideas in which you get a longer conversation with other kinds of thinkers. So I just want to be very, very careful about saying that there's like a radical break between the Ghannouchi before 2011 and the Ghannouchi after 2011. The shifts are much more subtle and nuanced than that, I think.
Dr. March, forgive me for interrupting. I'm just trying to keep pace.
Absolutely, yes.
I wanted to, Dr. Anjum, we're going to get back to you on the two questions about nationalism and foreign control. But before we do that, I want to ask, because you brought up Professor Abdessalem into the discussion, one of the things that you invited us to consider is that Islamist thought in the future will be post-statist. But it seems like to me that Professor Abdessalem is sitting on a very statist model of what Islamic thought could be. Or, Professor Shingiti is talking about Islamic constitutionalism, which seems quite statist to me. So I I wanted to ask you to say just very briefly what you meant by that, and then I'm going to ask them to respond to their questions and to that as well.
Thank you. Let me first of all respond to the question related to Ghannouchi thoughts, since following the ideas as well, the political conducts of Mr. Ghannouchi within the Tunisian context. I fully agree with my friend Andrew that there is no line of rupture between Ghannouchi pre-2011 and post-2011. There is a line of continuity. Of course, maybe the political context is different. Maybe Ghannouchi before 2011 is more interested in the theoretical and theological aspect and how to adapt the principles and mechanisms of democracy, check and balance powers, and other mechanisms within an Islamic framework. This is the main interest of Mr. Ghannouchi. And within this perspective, he's moving within the legacy and tradition of Islamic reformism since the 19th century. How to adapt the mechanisms and principles of democracy within an Islamic framework. It's the mechanism of adaptation, let's say, or parallelism. Shura is parallel to democracy, for example. The parliament is parallel to Majlis Shura. Maybe Mr. Ghannouchi has a lot of innovation, but generally speaking, he's moving within the borders and framework of Islamic reformism. It's liberalism by injection, let's say here. How to inject liberalism with Islamic principles and values. And the main question is how to create or to build a non-secular democracy. Like the question that we still raising within the Islamic circus is modernity, a non-secular modernity is possible. Is if modernity is seen as an unfinished project, as Habermas defined it, is it possible to have a non-secular modernity within an Islamic framework or within an Islamic background? These questions were raised within the literature and the discourse of Mr. Ghannouchi. In post-2011, maybe Mr. Ghannouchi is more interested on the concrete reality and the harsh reality of Tunisia within the Tunisian context. He's more looking at the balance of power, how to make deals and compromise and bargains with the different, political actors and even, competitors in very polarized, sometimes political context. So maybe Mr. Ghannouchi is becoming more pragmatic, more interested on politics or in democratic transformation based on the concrete realities and difficulties and complexity of the Tunisian context compared to pre-2011. Mr. Ghannouchi is more interested in ideas and ideals.
Dr. would you respond to Dr. Anjum's call for the Caliphate? I mean, where does Tunisia stand in that regard? I mean,
oh yeah. I think the nation state is a solid fact, and nationalism is a solid fact even within the Islamic world. But at the same time, this is the irony. The nation state is a fragile body, mainly in the Arab world. If you look at the Arab world, what is called the nation state is very fragile, is subject of external interventions, and it can't survive. It can't survive within the complexity of the international order and the era of globalization. I'm not sure, personally, I can't give a definitive answer that nation state is something of the past, but I'm sure the Muslim world needs some compromises and reconciliation between the nationalism and the ideals of Islamic Caliphate. And maybe we may need new ijtihads. The dominant narrative, the dominant view is Caliphate is something, transcendental, something from outside, the worldly affairs. And there is a need for new ijtihads from Muslim intellectuals and thinkers to insist on the immanence of the Islamic Caliphate. It is very common to contradict, for example, the will of God as transcendental creators with the will of man, with the ijtihads of some Islamic thinkers, like the ideas of Mr. Kanoushi, that the transcendental will of God could be embodied in the will of Ummah, the sovereignty of Ummah. And I think maybe we need new inventions and new ijtihads in the idea of the Islamic Caliphate. But definitely there is a need to reconcile the fact of the nationalism, the nation state in the Islamic world, as well the aspirations of the Muslim Ummah to overcome its weakness and shortcomings within this complex international orders and with the rise of globalization. So
for the sake of time, can I ask you to close your
That's
comments?
it. That's it. I finished here.
Please don't mind my interruption.
No, not at all.
Professor Shingiti, I want to turn it to you for a few minutes before we go back to Professor Anjum. Professor Anjum, I know that you have responses for both Professor March and Professor Abdessalem. If you could just hold on.
Well, my brother and friend, Dr. Anjum, we have lived together. We have some very nice moments at Mohamed bin Khalifa University in Qatar, and some very lively discussion and many differences of opinion about this issue. But I'd rather focus on the last point that has been raised about Khilafah. In my book about the constitutional crisis of Islamic civilization, I emphasize from a normative scriptural perspective that Islam did not require Muslims to live in one state, in one unified state. What is required in Islamic text is the unity of the Ummah. Wahdat al-Ummah, unity of the Ummah doesn't mean Wahdat al-Dawla. So we should avoid mixing the two. There is difference between unity of the Ummah and the unity of Dawla. Since the end of the Umayyad Empire, Muslims were never ruled by one unified state. And that was fact. I mean, we don't need even to jump to the issue of modern nation state. The Muslim world has been divided within many different states. And the status of the caliph, whether it was the caliph in Baghdad or the sultan in Istanbul, was not really ruling directly all the Islamic world. And therefore, I really don't think that there is need for much debate about caliphate. Maybe we should leave this to Hizb ut-Tahrir and some very small group. I don't think it's a serious issue today. What is serious issue is the unity of the Ummah and how to unify the will of the Ummah, how to have some kind of strategic cooperation between Muslim countries. The way, for example, you have NATO or European Union or any kind of transnational union based on some historical background or commonality of culture, etc. That's what we should focus on. If we want to give name caliph to the Secretary General of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, that's fine. I mean, he will have authority. He'll have authority like the authority of the Abbasid Caliph, for example, during the Seljuk time. But that doesn't mean anything in practical sense. So I don't think there is much need of that. I think Islam has lived with the territorial state for a long time. And Muslims have no choice today but to live with it. I mean, in the past, they live with it for practical reason. Today, they live with it for much more practical reason and necessities. I don't call it a modern national state. I call it territorial state. الدولة العقارية. It's just like a real estate So it's aqar. And I think that's how we should look at it. But there is no self-contradiction here. I mean, respecting the territorial state while working for unifying as many as you can of Muslims. Any kind of unity doesn't have to be integrated within one state. Of course, that's impossible. But unifying their strategies, their economies, opening borders between them, etc. That's what we need, I think, today. There are many. You ask me many questions. I don't know if it's time to talk about them or wait.
I'll come back to that.
Okay.
Just to keep the debate extended a few minutes more. There you have it. You know, you have Professor Shingiti saying the Caliph is a kind of symbolic and not really essential part of our political horizon. You have Abdessalem saying that nationalism is a fact. Get over this issue of a caliphate. I mean, we're going to have the nationalism. And Dr. March saying that, look, man, universal Caliphate of Man seems like a vision that we can work with. I mean, that it's a political vision. It's not something that is apolitical. How do you respond to these three?
Okay, so there's quite a bit to cover. I'll be as brief as possible. First of all, with Dr. Abdessalem and Shaykhana Dr. Shingiti, there seems like there's an unbridgeable gulf, but I think that to some degree it's an element of different focus, points of focus and semantics. But there is, of course, also I think that there is a challenge of imagination, which is why I began this way. That we really cannot imagine anything beyond what we are in right now. And that's a very dark place to be, I think, especially given that the Muslims everywhere are being massacred, that wherever there are Muslim states, these are failed states or failing states. But we remain incapable of even giving ourselves the permission to imagine. But I like Dr. Abdessalam's proposal that, look, you know, nation states are in some ways there to stay. But what I think we mean by nation state, I think has so radically changed that what I am willing to grant off that is that there is territorial administration. And those territorial local administrations not only are, I mean, I cannot say they are there to stay and they're solid facts, but nonetheless, they are convenient. And one does not need to get rid of them in order to imagine a different kind of, some kind of political, economic, and cultural unification, which is what I think the governance and self-governance of Ummah would require. Dr. Shingiti, I think he has a greater challenge when imagining anything beyond the nation states and perhaps the sad state of Gulf countries, and is something that is in fact perhaps sufficient to depress anyone. So I feel empathy for him. But nonetheless, this is, I think that the nation states, first of all, are not a solid fact. They have not become solidified until after the Second World War. And even then, they have been tottering worldwide, not only in the Muslim world. And with the rise of globalization in the 80s, their function has fundamentally begun to change, that they are becoming, if you will, security apparatus for global corporations rather than the center of sovereignty and identity for nations as they were imagined in the 19th century. Although in the 19th century, we lived in a world of empires, not nation states. So the imagination of the nation state came a couple centuries before the nation state actually arrived, and then it departed as soon as it arrived, almost, with the exception of 30 years after the Second World War. There's a lot of literature on this, cutting edge new literature in both political history, and so I don't think that I don't think we should take that for granted. to Dr. March, I would stand by my comment that the idea of the Caliphate of Man as it appeared in Maududi and then in Qutb was not a primarily political ideal. It was rather an interpretation of the verse 230, which is in Ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa. And in that verse, Allah is speaking of Adam, and classical exegetes understood that as successors who have some responsibilities on this earth, successors to some other creation. And Maududi, under the influence of some other thinkers, gave it this new meaning. But those meanings were available of honor and stewardship of mankind. And this belongs to non-Muslims as much as to Muslims. It's not specifically directed at the Ummah. So it's only over these following decades that this thing takes on a grounding for national communities in the Muslim world. Whereas when I say the caliphate as a political fact, I meant the caliphate understood as an office of someone who represents the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and governs the Ummah. And that was something that all classical Muslim jurists before and after the Mongol onslaught, and before and after, even after the power was actually lost in the 3rd century, they continued to imagine the Ummah, even without the administrative power or unity, as a continuity to the Prophet and as a synchronous, if you will, unity. So the Caliphate provided that imagination. Now, whether it was administratively united or not, that is a different question. I addressed that in my article at some length. And finally, I want to just say one more thing about this idea of foreign control and how Muslims ought to worry about the fact that global geopolitical powers are in control of Muslim nation states. It is true that Muslim nation states are a reality only because they are seen as necessary to underpin a political order, particularly in many Arab autocracies. They are simply gatekeepers and so security guards that Western powers have installed. That is perhaps some stark view, but there's some reality to it. But I don't think that those interests are permanent, and those understandings, even by Western global elite, are permanent. And I don't even think that that is our major problem, thinking as Muslim thinkers, that in fact, Western powers, or now Eastern powers, China, God knows who else, India, they think in very, they must rather think in realistic terms, that in fact, if you change the game as to how order can be kept, they will change who they are willing to make an alliance with. There is a growing literature in the West and elsewhere in international relations scholarship on, for example, the rise of the civilizational state, on trying to find an order between the nation state and global governance, called regional governance. So there is, in fact, a way to think beyond the nation state and also beyond foreign control.
Thank you, Professor Anjum. I want to turn it to Professor Shingiti. Would you care to respond to some of the comments made by Professor Anjum, and also some of the questions that were raised earlier by our viewers, especially around the question of prophecy and the non-Muslim state? You're muted. If you could unmute, please.
Well, I think My friend Dr. Anjum should not underestimate the power of dreaming and the power of memory. Any student of political philosophy, when he read Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, and he's talk about the Roman Republic, or even the Federalist Papers and how they were inspired by all of the modern democracies. When they started with this kind of dreaming and inspiration from the old days of Athens and Rome. And Muslims are dreaming, and they should be dreaming, but and they should have their imagination. But it doesn't mean that what they dream about is impossible. I think some of it is possible, and they should do their best within the circumstances. Again, I believe Islam is a practical religion. Territorial state was a fact, and it will continue to be fact. The unity of the Ummah was a must, was an obligation, and it will continue to be an obligation. In my book, I presented 3 theories about the unity of the Ummah that has been developed by three modern theorists. Abdurrazzaq Sanhuri and his idea about an Islamic League of Nations, and he was inspired by the experience of League of Nations. Malik Ben Nabi and his idea of an Islamic Commonwealth, and that's the title of his book. And also he has this idea of, inspired by the idea of British Commonwealth. There are some theories, practical, they will succeed only if they are practical. Yes, I wish we tear down the wall, as Reagan said about the wall of Berlin Wall, and we just open the borders between these countries. And I wish that will happen between, and I think it will happen between some countries. But if you look at the Ummah as a whole, we have to be practical about the ethnic differences, cultural differences, the geographical distances, etc. And I don't think it will be practical to dream about Moroccans and Afghans have same passport and in one state ruled by one government. But we can dream that Morocco and Afghanistan will have no visa, and they might have some military cooperation the same way New Zealand and Canada have, for example. And that kind of possibilities. So if we think practically, we don't have to make something stark contradiction between historical dream but we are not adapting to the reality that has been inherited from World War I, division inherited from European colonialism. But I think it's very good to be practical when we want to solve those very serious and old problems. Back to my questions. I mean, you ask about Shia and Wilayat al-Faqih, the possibility of Wilayat al-Faqih without Shi'ism. And I think actually what I used to talk about is Shi'ism without Wilayat al-Faqih. I don't think there is feature for Wilayat al-Faqih because it's against the mainstream Islamic theological and political thought of giving religious scholars no legitimacy, no political legitimacy over people. Muslim scholars are experts, and like any expert, there is difference between expertise and legitimacy. I mean, if professors of Harvard Law School said, "Oh no, we are the one who should legislate for the American people because, well, those congressmen have no idea about law and legal philosophy." I mean, that's not really, I think, should not be the case, because if you're expert, if you're the best expert, doesn't mean that you have the moral, that you don't have the political legitimacy. So the difference between a Harvard Law School professor and a congressman is this legitimacy, is not expertise. So yes, we respect the expertise of Muslim scholars, but doesn't mean you make them leaders and they impose their will over people. Why Islamic constitutionalism is a hot topic and seen as exception, I think this is something related to power relations today. In general, any expression of Islamic identity is seen in negative and very defensive way by others sometimes. We just think about the war between France and this small piece of cloth that we call hijab today, for example. And I think that's what nobody is talking about, those countries who have Catholicism as a official religion, or those who require that head of state has to be Buddhist or to be Lutheran, Christian, etc. Nobody is talking about that, but everybody is talking about those issues when raised within Islamic context. This is a power relation issue, and I think Muslims need to get out of this defensive mode. And
yeah, the power relation issue applies also to like Costa Rica, for instance. Or South American countries, for instance. You know, they have power differentials between them and the more powerful established West. I mean, but we don't see, for instance, that being an issue in those countries. Why is it with the Muslims?
Because they are Christian nations. I mean, just simply put, I mean, it's not the religious bias is a part of our identity, regardless of our secularism. I mean, you can find a very secular person, but he is very fanatical in terms of religious bias against others, and this is not new. So yeah, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that Muslims need to have more self-confidence and to avoid this defensive mode, and to focus on realizing what they aspire for, without any kind of misjudgment or injustice against minorities within the Muslim majority countries. But I think they don't need to think much about this kind of biased reaction against anything Islamic. And the key to all of this is democratization. And as Noah Feldman put it eloquently when he was working on the Iraqi constitution, and there are some congressmen who were rejecting the idea of putting many things about Islam in the constitution. And he told them, guys, let's be honest. Let's be frank about this. He said, simply put, more democracy means more Islam. So more democracy in Muslim majority countries means more Islam. And this might explain to us some of the debate that you have about Ghannouchi. Why now is moving toward Muslim democracy more than Islamic democracy? I think there is a pragmatic element here, which is, well, I don't need to talk much about Islam. I need to have a democracy, and Islam will come just as byproduct, simply because that's what people want to. That's what people want, and this is also happening in Turkey, even the officially secular Turkey. As Ahmed Koro and other researchers who study the Turkish secularism compared with the French and American secularism, that the more the Turkish democracy developed, the more you have Islamic presence in public life. So I think, yeah. Yes.
Can I interrupt you, please? Sorry, because we're running out of time. I would like to give
your last question, just if I can say in 1 minute. You ask about recognizing non-Muslim states. I don't see any problem with it. I mean, I don't see it as a problem, except in the mind of Hallaq. Maybe he said that one of the reasons Islamic State is impossible is because Islam divides the world into Dar Islam and Dar Harb, which is really an old idea of within that came within the context of the conflict between empire, and it has nothing to do with Islamic scripture. There is nothing called Dar Islam or Dar Harb in Quran or Sunnah, for example, and nobody is talking about it today. So, I mean, again, I think there are a lot of objections and noise about Islamic State and Islamic reference in politics and all of that, it doesn't need much of debate about it, because it's really biased. If I can say just to my friend Professor Anjum, that I think the idea of Andrew is right about the Caliphate of Man. We're not talking here about caliphate in the administrative or political sense, but the question is, as they ask in philosophy of religion, who has the interpretive authority? Who has the implementation authority? Is the divine message addressed to the collective entity of Ummah, or is it addressed to a ruler, and that ruler will implement it and impose it on us? These are two different approaches, and I think Islam actually made the Ummah the one who has the interpretive and implementation authority, not the ruler.
Professor
Wallahu
Shingiti,
alam. Barakallah.
thank you so much for your comments. We've run out of time, but I want to give Professor March and Professor Abdessalem a few minutes to just respond as quickly as possible if there was anything that you thought would need clarification or you would like to respond. Professor March, could you please make your closing comments? You're muted.
The one thing I didn't really get a chance to talk about was your first question about moral pluralism, whether it's unique versus something that can be discussed in the past. And it's very, very common, so like there's a very, very common, for lack of a better term, apologetic move in Islamic discourses, which is to say something like, and I'm not making fun of this because I think it has some plausibility, but like, Islam was always better and more tolerant than the Latin West. We had Jews, we had Christians, we never had persecution. We had the Millah system, et cetera, et cetera. Now there's a certain, historical experience bears this out in the Ottoman Empire and Andalus, so on and so forth. And so that's fine as far as it goes. And there were very, very rare cases of actual religious persecutions, maybe during the Muwahhidun in Spain or something like this. But the obvious difference is that pluralism is no longer intra-religious pluralism. If everybody was an Abrahamic, we'd have the Abrahamic agreement, right? Which I don't think anybody here is particularly fond of. So the point is that pluralism today is not just between Muslims, Jews, and Christians, but there's also various kinds of secularists, and the pluralism internal to Islam, internal to Muslims, right? Now, whether somebody outwardly declares themselves to be secular or post-Muslim or whatever, the point is there's all kinds of attitudes towards what is the Shari'ah, what is the authoritative foundation of it. So that's one obvious thing. The scope of pluralism is much, much broader. But the other thing, and here's the more interesting feature, is that like Mohamed said, pre-modern states were not nation states, they were empires, for better or worse, right? Sometimes empires were much more tolerant than nation states, right? The Armenian issue happened after Turkey became a nation state, not under the Ottoman Empire, okay? So in many cases, empires deal with pluralism much more easily than nation states, which have to create a homogeneous population. But the other issue is that in the modern period, there are certain kinds of expectations for a public sphere, for, if not for democracy, for some idea that the state is going to speak to its ra'iyya as citizens and no longer just as ra'iyya. So, the challenge of the relationship between the governed and the state has been radically transformed. And I would argue that whatever you think about traditionalism or non-traditionalism, or even if you're a critic of liberalism or a critic of secularism or a critic of Western democracy, almost everybody in modern Muslim countries wants to relate to their state as a citizen and not as a subject. And so that's where the dimension of moral pluralism comes, because the state is addressing its citizens in some, or is supposed to anyway, ideally, as a representative. And pre-modern sultans or whatever did not experience that kind of obligation. The relationship was both more coercive and thinner. So, so that's what I think is new about the problem of pluralism. Why it's nice if somebody wants to say pre-modern or even the Covenant of Medina prepares us for modern pluralism, but it's an invented tradition.
Thank you so much. Professor Abdessalem, is there anything you'd like to say very briefly?
I tried
We're over time.
Yes, I try to be brief. Just to mention the initial idea that I raised, that the nation state is a solid fact, and at the same time it is a fragile body. This does not mean that the nation state is the byproduct of divine history. It's the byproduct of the balance of power in the region. In the post-Ottoman order after the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire were disintegrated, and the nation state within the region, mainly the Arab world, were the byproduct of such process of the emergence of new imperial powers that marginalized the Turks. I think the modern Turkey itself is the subject of such contradiction and irony. On one hand, you have the solid fact of the solid state, the nation state, modern Turkey. But at the same time, the new elite in Turkey, including Islamists, discovered the fragility and the limits of the nation state. And this is what the origin of what is called the new Ottomanism. It's not an ideology. It is based on the raison d'etat. When modern Turkey is looking at the international order and the balance of power in the region, it is by instinct and reason at the same time. They discover the benefit of the aspirations of the unity of the Islamic world. I think there are two approaches within the region. You have the approach of the Abdullah al-Irwi, when he said that the nation state is a solid fact, and we have such imagination of the utopia of the united Ummah or the Caliphate, for the simple reason that we are reading the literature and the legacy of the Fuqaha, Siyasa Shari'ah. And we need to get rid of such imagination. It's invalid and useless. And we have to consolidate the idea of the nation state. I don't agree about this approach. On the other hand, we have the approach of the Hizb al-Tahrir, which looks at the Caliphate, Islamic Caliphate, as something ideal and historical, which is have nothing to do with the concrete reality of the Muslim world. Maybe the reality is something in between. The nation state is a solid fact, but I fully agree with Dr. Shingiti that the ideals of unity, the imagination of unity of the Muslim Ummah, still valid in the consciousness of the Muslims, and there is it based on the pragmatic reason that there is a need of such integration, let's say, within certain Islamic countries. Let's say if we can't, unite the whole Islamic world, which will be impossible, even historically speaking, there is such a dialectics between what is called Dawlat al-Inqisam and Dawlat al-Wahda. Dawlat al-Inqisam, the fragmented Islamic state, either in North Africa or the Eastern Arab world or India, and at the same time the aspirations, the ideas, the imagination of unity. Utopia is something valid. It's not, something phantasm and illusion. Maybe we need such combination between the concrete reality and the imagination of the Islamic world, the Ummah, and the new Caliphate. Why not?
Thank you so much, Professor Abdessalem, Professor March, Professor Shingiti, Professor Anjum. I thank you very much for joining us and actually indulging us for an overtime discussion. To our translators, thank you so much for being patient and translating for our viewers. I want to thank also all those who are tuning in. Sorry we started a little late, but alhamdulillah, everybody was able to participate and we had a very lively discussion. Tomorrow, we're going to have 2 sessions at 3 p.m. and 7 p.m. The flyers are on the screen. I look forward to all of you tuning in. from Istanbul. Thank you very much. Next time, hopefully we'll be able to do this in person. Good-
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.